no problem with the word center, because in architecture, the word center means a false thing that holds other things together. So I don't like the word center, but we won't go there today. Everything you do in your library, whether it's your own scholarship, whether you do it in your teaching, whether you do it in your services, it's all one little step towards bettering that EDI at your library, bettering that EDI work at your institution. So if you get to lead a working group or a committee, and I fully acknowledge we are all tired of doing EDI work, but if you can do something like that, it doesn't have to be an EDI committee. It could be a hiring committee. It could be a collection committee, whatever it is. You ask the question, just ask the question. You don't have to do all the work, just ask the question. Okay, how is this work anti-racist? How is this work inclusive? What can we do better to make it more inclusive and make it less racist, right? And see what answers come up. Let them talk it out. Let them come up with solutions. It doesn't have to be always us who ask the questions and come up with solutions. So I'll stop there and see if David wants to talk again.
Is that an invitation to do something other than having a coughing fit?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, all right, cool. Let's see if I can manage that. Apologies if I broke anybody's eardrums with that coughing fit. You know, I think, you know, regardless of the kind of work that we end up doing, you know, whether it's joining a grassroots campaign to demilitarize the campus and trying to host events within your library and support that kind of work, or whether it's you know, doing some more traditional forms of EDI work, I really think the most important thing that we can do is make sure that the actions are undertaken while simultaneously and sort of meaningfully engaging with the kinds of difficult and structurally threatening questions that I referenced earlier, right? I think we have to simultaneously hold front and center a broader critique of racial capitalism, because absent that structural critique, it becomes just a way of fixing the system, right? A way of making the institution more hospitable, to use Sandy Grande's term, right? So, you know, I really, and if we're serious about recognizing that our institutions, not at an individual level, but at a systemic level, are founded in white supremacy and settler colonialism, then it can't, the anti-racism we do can't just be about celebrating, you know, the events we do shouldn't just be about celebrating the institution themselves, right? They shouldn't be sort of celebrated as sort of anti-racist ends in themselves. They always, I think, have to be sort of accountable to larger problems to which they're connected. So if we talk about EDI, we really have to think about included in what, right? You know, what kinds of spaces, what kinds of structures, what kind of broader institutions are we trying to make diverse, right? Which is not to say that inclusion is always a bad thing, but we can't substitute it as it can't be sort of the dominant. I think it's problematic when it becomes a kind of the dominant framework through which we think about how racial power operates, right? So I made it through that with no coughing, so I think I'm going to sort of take that as a win and maybe mute myself.
Thank you, David. We will move on to question 3. Now, okay, so back to that word center. How do we center patron voices in conversations about racism and provide a space for patrons to inform our anti-racist work? To Ashley first.
Yeah, so in addition to the preset questions, we also received some questions that registrants had sent us. One of them was about meaningful engagement with Indigenous communities. And so for the person who's watching that, my answer to this question may help with an answer towards that question that you submitted. And really it comes down to listening. And Kwamkwam Helam talks about listening with both of your ears, but also your heart. So you've got 3 ears in total. And so listen, actively listen and engage in dialogue, build relationship, and show up. I think a lot of EDI work, as we've talked about, can be performative, and it can be. That's not how a relationship is built. And when we talk about working with patrons or engaging with community, what we are really talking about is a relationship. And so we need to listen to the other person, and we need to show up consistently. And we also, part of that is not expecting our patrons to give us the answer to fix the library. That's not possible. We need to hear their experiences and then check our own reactions, because if our reaction is defensive, that could be why they don't feel like it's a safe and welcoming place for them. Or they might, if we're talking about engaging with Indigenous community, why they might not want to engage with you on that project. And so it's a really short answer, but I think it really gets down to the heart of it, which is we are talking about relationships with this question, and those take time to develop and time to maintain, just like any relationship with a friend, your family, or your partner. You need to put in the work, and you need to listen and respond respectfully. And I have very few notes. Actually, that's going to be my answer, is it's relationships, and we need to respect what people are saying and act on it. And some of it is going to be checking our own reactions to both what they're saying, but also how we move forward in a good way.
And to Norda.
Yeah, so my response is similar to Ashley's. I wrote, in order to center patron voices, we need to decenter our voices, white voices, and this might mean making those safe spaces to have conversations in our library for BIPOC patrons. And when I'm thinking patrons, I'm thinking in an academic library, that would be the undergraduate students, graduate students, faculty, staff, and our community members. So yeah, it's listening to the patrons, and I say really listening. It means also giving up power, our power as gatekeepers, as professionals, as the experts who know everything. And then, I just think about the past and going back before George Floyd and the limelight on Black Lives Matter, because I feel like everything is situated in this time, this moment in time. And I want us to reflect on before George Floyd and the limelight of Black Lives Matter. What were our patrons telling us? How did we respond to that? Because I feel that perhaps the current events have influenced our openness to actually listen. So why did we respond in that way? How, oops, I think I turned off my light, but how did we respond? What can you do better? And I also agree with Ashley about building relationship, and with our local groups at York, we've had individuals and we had student groups, like the Black student group they connected with us about creating a Black History Month display in the library. We also had another PhD student who came to us about missing why were there no Black philosophers in our collection, for example. So we worked with her to do an exhibition on Anton Willem Amo. So in those cases, the students came to us, but I feel, and I'm kind of embarrassed that they came to us, and I think an anti-racist approach would be to proactively seeking those relationships with our users and making spaces for them. And so I just reiterate that it's important to be quiet and to listen and to build those relationships.
And to David.
Hey, yeah, I some sort of similar themes, and I hope what I'm about to say is sort of seen as a compliment, to what Norda and Ashley have already said. As has been implied, I don't think there's a formula, but I think there are some things I'd like to see us avoid, and as has kind of been hinted at, in library school and throughout our lives as library workers, I think it's really drummed into us to sort of center the user, and I get why, and I see value in doing that, and believe me, that's a sort of central thing that I think about in terms of all the work I do. But at the same time, the way that this idea of centering the user plays out does raise its own set of questions and problems that clearly become significant when we think about anti-academic libraries and anti-racism. So first of all, who are the patrons whose voices we're thinking about, right? And then what does center mean? Again, as has been suggested, we have to really think about what center actually means. What does it mean to center the voices of someone, right? Library users aren't homogenous. They aren't homogenous in terms of the ways in which they're positioned in and the ways in which they're invested in structures that are sustained by racially animated violence. You know, one of the central kind of ideas that has been circulated in the sort of Black Lives Matter era, for lack of a better way of naming it, has been the idea that we center Black voices, which I think is a clear response to the specific dynamics around the structuring of authority in movements. And I think we're starting to see it in anti-racist responses in libraries, in responses that, you know, are critical of any intervention that doesn't center Black voices, that include the sort of specific imperative that we center Black users or more broadly BIPOC voices. And there's obviously value in thinking through this sort of different racialized forms of authority from within our field. But at the same time, centering Black users raises similar problems, just that phrase, that idea, because it so easily shows up as an approach that's, I think, analytically suspect and politically fraught. And to put it simply, it lends itself to a sort of tokenism by which library workers or institutions sort of treat as interchangeable any member of communities understood to be Black, right? By which sort of everything that emanates from the lips of someone understood to be Black is uncritically taken as the truth, you know, by which people sort of start clapping before I've even finished talking, and there's not really any indication that they're engaging critically or substantively with what I have to say. And there's sort of no recognition that Black politics is not homogenous, that, you know, like Kamala Harris is not Assata Shakur and Oprah Winfrey is not, you know, Robin Maynard, right? But too often we see sort of folks trying to anxiously abide by like lists like how to be a white ally, and that end up sort of like more or less sort of suggesting this kind of interchangeability. And at its core, I think there's a kind of abdication of responsibility at play, in that people bypass the need to engage meaningfully with, you know, to put in the work, as I think Ashley said earlier, you know, to put in the work of engaging meaningfully with the complexities of racial politics and the need to engage specifically in the ways in which the violence of white supremacy is sustained not just by explicit racists, but by the elevation of particular kinds of non-white voices, particular kinds of BIPOC voices, and the celebration of particular kinds of anti-racism. And instead of engaging with these sorts of complexities and to a certain degree, providing yourself a foundation to sort of listen with both of your ears, as Ashley put it earlier, they instead sort of operate in on a sort of simplistic politics of inclusion and privilege, by which they sort of assume that there's this group called white people who can't possibly understand or know, and this group of called Black people who all know, we all understand innately somehow, all of our analysis is more or less the same, politically speaking. And the result is, ironically, that institutions end up amplifying and presenting as universal the Black voices who align with their own institutional interests in politics, right, who are institutionally safe, which in the end is not about centering Black voices. It's about amplifying the voice of the institution. It's not about substantively challenging the structures that the institution is embedded in. It's about being convenient and tokenistic, right? So I think we have to step back from this tendency to let homogenized accounts of the user experience or the user voice, or even like the Black student voice, you know, letting that serve as a stand-in for your own analysis that you develop through dialogue and relationship, leads to these sort of tokenistic approaches. So, you know, and I come back similarly to my panelists to the importance of relationship, of sort of being in community and recognizing a shared investment in liberation and taking a responsibility for developing an analysis and structural critique in an ongoing way that can inform those kinds of conversations based on listening, that can inform participating openly and with an open heart in those kinds of conversations. You know, an analysis that sort of might allow us to attend in a nuanced way to the dynamics of the communities within which our libraries are situated, right? So again, I really think we need to